So I'm going to take you through the general structure and the overview of the handbook. As Julian said, it's been a journey, and part of that journey was moving from what is currently version 5.2, up to version 6. We spent a good day at his house, so you can see on the right-hand side there, where we basically had all the chapters and components of chapters on his kitchen table, where we organized and shuffled them around and tried to organize content. Obviously, methods have advanced quite a lot. There's lots of new things to incorporate. So we spent some time thinking about how to best organize all this new content. One of the things that we were very mindful of was that the version 5 works as a really valuable resource internationally, and we didn't want to break it. So what we're doing is very much building on all the work that went into version 5. So in terms of what happened, first of all, bearing in mind what Julian was saying about making sure that we were mindful of the wide readership and user base of the handbook, we decided that we would move content which is aimed specifically at Cochrane reviews so that it's online. We did this for two reasons. One, because, as you'll see in a moment, we have an awful lot of content in the new handbook and some new chapters, so we needed some space. But also, this is the type of material which tends to change quite a lot in terms of the processes and editorial processes for Cochrane. And so we thought, well, we'll put it online. That means we can update it when necessary. It's not necessarily fixed, as might be the case in a printed document. And also, then that gives us the ability to keep the focus on the handbook to the methodological issues that are of widespread interest. So the online stuff is going online. And then the core methods, and the core methods have seen a lot of development, the most development in the book. So bearing in mind that we've taken the introduction out of the printed book, we obviously needed an introduction. So we've got a new chapter starting a review, and then two relatively new chapters, one very new chapter and one chapter which has expanded quite a lot on the content of the first chapter. So you can see in version 5 we've got a chapter on defining the review question and developing criteria for including studies. Those are clearly two different things, so they're now split out into two different chapters. One is around the scope of the review, one's around defining criteria and thinking about the synthesis. And what I should say actually is that I'll take you through the overview of the book at this point, and then we're going to give you tasters of some of the chapter content further down the road. So there's a little change here in terms of searching, in that in version 5 you'll have been used to selecting studies being situated in the following chapter, whereas in this version what we've done is we put selecting studies in with searching. So it's searching and selecting studies, study identification in one chapter. Then thinking about data collection, one of the, I think, fairly early innovations, I remember Julian emailing me about it, was, well, we really need to break out advice on choosing effect measures and computing estimates of effect. It's one of the areas that people find quite tricky at times, and so we've got more developed and specific guidance on that. And as Julian is going to outline, we're considering bias in a number of different domains now. We had one chapter assessing risk of bias in included studies. We can see now that risk of bias and considerations of bias are considered in a number of new domains. We've got a new chapter, chapter 9, which is about preparing for synthesis. So there may be a statistical synthesis, there may be not, there may be a range of different types of analysis that take place, but we need some formal methods for thinking about how we prepare our studies and our data for synthesis, and that's what this chapter covers. Then we get into the real sort of like the heart of the review, if you like, the analysis, the synthesis, and here we've got some new chapters. You can see that we had analyzing data and undertaking meta-analysis in version 5. We've still got that chapter in version 6, but we've now got two additional chapters. There's network meta-analysis, which Julian will talk about, and also synthesizing, presenting findings using other methods. So still quantitative findings, but not necessarily using meta-analysis. So here it's partly in response to both user demand and methodological development that we've got sort of this new breadth of methods here, especially I think in terms of network meta-analysis, where decision makers are saying, well, we need to be able to choose between different options of interventions. And so being able to give people more advice in that way is certainly potentially making the reviews more easy to use. But also we've got far more capacity now in terms of methods and ability to do these types of analysis. So the two coming together mean that network meta-analysis is now in the core section of methods. Finally, two chapters which have changed a bit, because obviously there's been methodological development, but are more similar to the versions that you'll be familiar with, around summary of findings tables and interpreting results and drawing conclusions. So those are the core methods, and as you can see, we've gone from 8 chapters there up to 15. So there's a lot more guidance available on the detail of how to go about doing reviews. Moving on to the special topics now, there are two areas that we've broken these into: specific perspectives in reviews and then other topics. And there's more continuity here, I think, probably between versions 5 and 6. So we've still got the chapter, or a chapter, which has obviously been worked on again on non-randomized studies. We've got a chapter on adverse effects, economics evidence. The one chapter which has disappeared from the new version is special topics and statistics, but I should reassure you that the special topics themselves haven't disappeared, only the chapter itself. What we've done is we've identified more natural homes for that content. They were actually important topics in statistics. So what we've done is move that content into some of the core chapters so that it's more available in the areas where you're most likely to need the advice. We've got a chapter on patient-reported outcomes, individual participant data now rather than patient data. We've got prospective approaches to accumulating evidence, and this one has changed a little bit. Yes, we're still covering prospective meta-analysis, but this chapter now also covers updating sort of living systematic review issues, and also advice on repeated meta-analysis. So there's a sort of a range of different issues being covered there now in terms of prospective approaches to accumulation of evidence. We've got the chapter which has been reworked again on qualitative evidence. And the chapter on public health and health promotion really covered a lot about intervention complexity. So now we've got a specific chapter which sort of pulls out the issues relating to intervention complexity. The overviews of reviews, I should have mentioned in the online section is in the online section, so has moved there. Right, and in terms of new chapters in these areas, we've got a new chapter on equity, which is chapter 16 there. We've got a chapter on including variance on randomized trials, so crossover trials and that kind of thing. And we've got a new chapter on assessing risk of bias in a non-randomized study. So if you put it all together, this is what it looks like. It's really quite a substantial contribution in terms of methodological advice, and you can see in purple there and bold the new or considerably revised chapters. So there's been a lot of new development and a lot of new writing that's gone into this version of the handbook. Finally, in my little opening section here, I should mention the messier methodological expectations of Cochrane Intervention reviews. Those standards are integrated throughout the handbook in boxes. So wherever in the handbook there is a advice or methodological guidance given, the relevant methodological expectation is also then put there, so that we've got a nice correspondence between the detailed guidance in the handbook and that methodological expectation. Right, I'll hand over to myself now and talk about the opening sections. And what I'm going to do is just give you a few little tasters. I'm going to go through these quite quickly because I don't want to take up loads of time on these. So what we're going to do now is just give you some little snippets of information about each chapter or each area of chapters. So chapter 1, as you might expect from a chapter which is around about opening a book on systematic reviews. It covers issues about why we should do a review, the questions, who should do a review, the involvement of consumers, stakeholders, covers reliability, the development of protocols, and issues around data management. The idea of this chapter is that it's generic advice. Anybody doing a systematic review can use it, and the sort of like the Cochrane specific advice is in the online chapters. Then, as I mentioned before, we've got a lot more advice on determining the scope of the review and how we're going to address particular questions. We've got advice on rationale for formulation of questions, consideration of the review's PICO, which I've got a slide on, which I'll talk you through, ensuring the review addresses the right questions, and again then highlighting how you get those perspectives into the review team to ensure that the right questions are being addressed and also in the right way. So priority assessing exercises and engaging stakeholders. And then we've got advice on methods and tools which help you structure the review. So logic models have an explicit mention in this chapter, so definitions of logic models are here, and then later on in chapter 17 on intervention complexity, there's actually a sort of like a diagram and a worked example. And economic data again is highlighted here, but as you'll have no doubt spotted, we've got a chapter on that later on in the book as well. So I mentioned the PICO, and I think that this is one of the sort of like the light bulb moments that we had when we were working on this, and it really came from Joe McKenzie and Sue Brennan on their work on some of the chapters, and they in turn have highlighted the role of the linked data project and the development of the PICO ontology as being something that sparked thoughts for them. So there's been a whole load of thinking around PICO, and what we've realized really is that PICO doesn't just sort of sit at one level. We've got a review level PICO, which we plan at the beginning of the review, and this is the PICO, which I should say for those of you who are not familiar with PICO, it's an acronym for the Population, Intervention, Comparator and Outcome in the that the review is going to be looking at. So we can specify the level of a PICO at the level of the review, which will determine which studies we might include or exclude from the review. And that then can be broken down into more detailed PICOs for each synthesis, again, which is also planned at the protocol stage. But then we mustn't forget then that we need to think about the PICO of the included studies. Actually, what did we end up with? Sometimes we may start off looking for a particular PICO, but the PICO of the studies that we end up with in the review might actually be a sort of considerably smaller subset of what we were looking for. And that will have implications for the conclusions that we can draw from the review. So it's one of those things that we should bear in mind. Right. Defining the criteria for including studies. So that's a key new chapter. I think it's builds on that articulation of the PICO that I was mentioning there, just deciding which types of study to include, and also covering some of the key Messier standards in terms of eligibility criteria. I just wanted to highlight for you here, and this is probably good for someone who's looking at the slides afterwards, that some of the guidance that's given in that chapter, which is chapter 3, where we've got sort of the steps involved, which are identifying intervention characteristics, which may modify the effect of the intervention, some advice on considerations and the methodological tools available to help, and then some examples, which you might then go and look up if that's an example that's particularly relevant for your review. So what we've hoped to do here is really help people in terms of the detail of how to go about operationalizing some of the guidance available in the handbook. So I'm going to move on quite quickly now. There's extended and extensive advice now on searching and selecting studies. There's advice in the handbook itself, but then there's also going to be online guidance which then supplements and expands on the advice in the handbook. So there's a lot more information on designing a search, where to search. There's some information on regulatory agency sources and clinical study reports, which is new, and there's some stuff on software, new technologies as well as lots of other material.